A happy life turned upside down. Zahara was the kind of girl whose laughter could light up a room. At 16, she carried an air of effortless joy, her warm brown eyes always gleaming with excitement. She had a smile that made people feel welcomed, a heart that was endlessly kind, and a family that made her feel safe and loved. She lived in a small but beautiful house with her parents, Baba Malik and Mama Saud, in a peaceful neighborhood. Their home was always filled with warmth, Mama Sauda's delicious meals scented the air, and Baba Malik's deep laughter echoed through the halls. Every morning, Zahara's mother would pack her lunch, giving her an affectionate pat on the head before sending her off to school. Her father would then drive her, always reminding her to stay kind and work hard. "Remember, my Zahara," he would say with a playful grin, "kindness is like the sun. It makes everything grow." Zahara had wonderful friends at school, a close-knit group who shared stories, laughter, and dreams of the future. They played games, made silly jokes, and dreamed of the endless possibilities life held for them. Zahara had big dreams too. She wanted to become a teacher, just like her mother, and inspire children to love learning. Everything in her life felt perfect. Until the night that changed everything. An empty home, a shattered heart. That evening, Zahara had stayed a little longer after school, finishing a group assignment with her friends. By the time she started walking home, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. She hummed softly, clutching her backpack as she turned the corner to her house. She expected to be greeted by the familiar smell of her mother's cooking, the soft hum of the radio playing old songs in the background, and her father sitting on the couch, reading his newspaper. But something was wrong. The house was completely silent. Zahara frowned. Her parents were never out this late without telling her. She called out, "Mama, Baba," but there was no answer. Her heart pounded as she moved through the house, checking every room. The kitchen was empty, the living room undisturbed. Their bedroom door was open, but there was no sign of them. Her father's phone and wallet were still on the nightstand, which only made her stomach twist with worry. Where could they be? She sat on the couch, trying to stay calm. Maybe they had stepped out for something important. Maybe they had gone to visit a neighbor and lost track of time. But as the minutes turned into hours, the silence of the house became unbearable. She tried calling their phones. No answer. She sent messages. No reply. A terrible feeling settled in her chest, one she couldn't shake no matter how hard she tried. The call that changed everything. By midnight, fear had completely taken over. Zahara curled up on the couch, hugging herself tightly, trying to fight the tears threatening to spill. Then, her phone rang. She scrambled to grab it, her breath catching when she saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. A flicker of hope sparked in her chest as she quickly answered. "Hello," she whispered. A deep, serious voice spoke on the other end. "Is this Zahara Malik?" "Yes," she said, gripping the phone tightly. "Who is this? Do you know where my parents are?" There was a pause before the voice responded, more gently this time. "I'm calling from the city hospital. Your parents, there was a car accident." "I'm very sorry, Zahara, but they didn't survive." The world around her stopped. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. The words "a car accident" and "didn't survive" repeated in her mind like a terrible echo. Her fingers went numb, and the phone slipped from her grasp, crashing onto the floor. A ringing sound filled her ears as her vision blurred. This couldn't be real. It had to be a mistake. Her parents were strong, full of life, always smiling. They weren't gone. They couldn't be gone. Her chest tightened as a piercing scream tore from her throat. A life without them. Zahara didn't remember much after that. The neighbors came rushing in, their faces filled with concern. Auntie Kemi, their closest family friend, wrapped Zahara in her arms as she sobbed uncontrollably. Someone picked up her phone, speaking to the person on the other end, confirming what Zahara wished was a nightmare. Through her tears, she heard whispers. They were on their way home, a truck ran a red light, hit their car, both died on the spot. The words felt like knives stabbing her heart. She didn't fight when Auntie Kemi led her upstairs, helping her into bed. But sleep never came. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, numb and empty. She had lost everything. The next morning, she woke up hoping, praying, that it had all been a bad dream. But the moment she walked downstairs and saw the sorrowful expressions of her neighbors, the truth came crashing down again. Her parents were gone. Forever. Her beautiful, happy life had been shattered in a single night. And she had no idea what was going to happen next. Life in the orphanage. The days after her parents' funeral were a blur for Zahara. She hardly spoke, hardly ate. Everything felt distant, like she was walking through a fog. Auntie Kemi did her best to comfort her, but nothing could fill the emptiness left behind. Then, one morning, Auntie Kemi sat her down with a sorrowful expression. "Zahara, sweetheart," she said gently, taking her hands. "I wish I could keep you here with me, but I don't have the means to take care of you." Zahara's heart clenched. "I spoke with the authorities," Auntie Kemi continued. "They found a place for you, a good place, where you'll be safe. A home for children like you." The words sent a chill through her. A home for children like me. An orphanage. Zahara wanted to scream, to tell Auntie Kemi that she didn't belong in a place like that. But the truth was, she had nowhere else to go. A lonely beginning. The orphanage was a large, old building with high walls and a heavy gate. As soon as Zahara stepped inside, she felt like an outsider. Children ran around the courtyard, laughing and playing, but she stood stiffly by the entrance, clutching the small bag of belongings she had brought with her. The matron, an older woman with kind but tired eyes, placed a gentle hand on Zahara's shoulder. "This will be your home now, my dear," she said. Home. The word made Zahara's throat tighten. She was led to a room with several bunk beds. Other girls were chatting and folding clothes, but when they saw her, they fell silent. Some of them gave her curious looks, others simply ignored her. Zahara sat on the edge of an empty bed, staring at the bare walls. That night, she cried herself to sleep, muffling her sobs with a pillow. Meeting turned. The next morning, Zahara forced herself to leave her room and explore the orphanage. She wasn't hungry, but she knew she had to eat. As she made her way to the dining hall, she bumped into someone, literally. A boy, a little taller than her, with dark skin and bright, mischievous eyes, grinned at her. He had a lopsided smile that made him look like he was always up to something. "Whoa, slow down," he said, stepping back. "You must be the new girl." Zahara wiped her eyes quickly, not wanting him to see she had been crying. "Yeah," she mumbled. "I'm Tond," he introduced himself. "And you are?" "Zahara." Tond tilted his head. "Zahara," he repeated. "That's a nice name." She said nothing. He leaned in slightly. "You don't talk much, do you?" Zahara shrugged, looking down. Tond didn't seem offended. Instead, he smiled again. "That's okay. I talk enough for both of us." And he did. Over the next few days, Tond made it his mission to pull Zahara out of her shell. He showed her around the orphanage, introduced her to the other children, and even defended her when some of the older kids made remarks about her being quiet. One afternoon, when she was sitting alone under a tree, he plopped down beside her. "You know," he said, tossing a small rock in the air, "I was like you when I first got here." Zahara glanced at him. Like me. Ton nodded. Didn't talk to anyone. Didn't eat much. Just wanted to disappear. What changed? Ton hesitated before answering. I realized that no matter how much I wanted my old life back, it wasn't coming back. So, I had to decide, was I going to stay sad forever, or was I going to find something worth smiling about again? Zahara swallowed hard. Ton grinned. You'll figure it out too. And when you do, I'll be here. For the first time since she arrived, Zahara felt the smallest spark of warmth in her chest. A new routine. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, Zahara started to adjust. She wasn't happy, not yet. But she no longer felt completely alone. She helped the younger children with their homework, played games with Ton and the others, and started eating properly again. The pain of losing her parents was still there, but she had found small moments of peace in the midst of it. One evening, Ton found her sitting on the orphanage steps, watching the sunset. You look less miserable than usual, he teased. Zahara rolled her eyes but smiled slightly. I guess. Ton nudged her shoulder. Told you you'd figure it out. A life-changing visit. One afternoon, the matron called for a meeting. Children, we have visitors today, she announced. They are looking to adopt, so please be on your best behavior. A ripple of excitement spread through the orphanage. Adoption was rare, and when it did happen, it usually meant a better life. Zahara, however, felt uneasy. She wasn't sure if she wanted a new family. The visitors arrived shortly after, a well-dressed couple who looked rich and sophisticated. Mr. and Mrs. Adeyemi. The man wore an expensive suit, and the woman had long braided hair with gold earrings that shimmered in the light. They walked around, observing the children, speaking to the matron, and asking questions. Zahara sat quietly in the corner, trying not to be noticed. She had no interest in being chosen. But then, Mrs. Adeyemi's eyes landed on her. She whispered something to her husband, who nodded. They approached Zahara. What is your name, dear? Mrs. Adeyemi asked, her voice smooth and kind. Zahara hesitated. Zahara. Mrs. Adeyemi smiled. Such a beautiful name. Mr. Adeyemi nodded approvingly. She looks well-mannered. She would fit in with our family. Zahara blinked in surprise. They were choosing her. The matron smiled warmly. Zahara is a wonderful girl. She's been through a lot, but she's strong. Mrs. Adeyemi reached out and took Zahara's hands. Would you like to come home with us, Zahara? Zahara's heart pounded. She glanced at Ton, who was watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. A part of her wanted to say no. This was the first place where she had begun to heal. But another part of her, a part she didn't want to admit existed, wanted to believe in family again. She swallowed hard and nodded. Yes. Mrs. Adeyemi smiled brightly. Wonderful. Welcome to your new home, my dear. As Zahara packed her few belongings that night, she felt a strange mix of emotions, hope, nervousness, and something else she couldn't quite name. Ton found her before she left. So, this is it, huh? He said, rubbing the back of his head. Zahara nodded. Yeah. Good luck, Zahara. His voice was quiet. You too, she whispered. For some reason, leaving the orphanage felt harder than she expected. As she got into the Adeyemi's car and watched the orphanage disappear in the distance, she clutched her hands together. She wanted to believe that this was the start of something good. She wanted to believe that she had found a family again. But something deep inside her whispered a warning. And soon, she would realize why a nightmare unfolds. Zahara stared out the car window as the Adeyemi's sleek black SUV glided through the city. She had never ridden in a car this luxurious before. The leather seats smelled new, the air conditioning was cool against her skin, and soft music played from hidden speakers. She wanted to believe this was the start of a new life, one filled with love and care. She wanted to believe she had found a family again. But something deep inside her, a quiet whisper of unease, told her that not everything was as it seemed. A house that felt too perfect. When the car pulled up to the Adeyemi home, Zahara's breath caught in her throat. The house was massive. A towering mansion with high white pillars, glass windows that sparkled under the sunlight, and a perfectly trimmed garden. It looked like something out of a movie. Mrs. Adeyemi turned to her with a dazzling smile. "Welcome home, Zahara." "Home." Zahara forced a smile and nodded. As they walked inside, she marveled at the grand chandelier hanging in the foyer, the marble floor so polished they reflected her image, and the wide staircase that spiraled up to the second floor. "This is your room," Mr. Adeyemi announced as he led her into a spacious bedroom. It had a soft pink bed, elegant curtains, and even a small desk near the window. Zahara's eyes widened. "This is all for me." Mrs. Adeyemi laughed lightly. "Of course, my dear. You are part of the family now." For the first time since she left the orphanage, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe this was real. Maybe she had finally found a place where she belonged. But the illusion wouldn't last long. The shift in behavior. At first, the Adeyemis were kind. Mrs. Adeyemi gave her beautiful dresses to wear. Mr. Adeyemi praised her for being well-mannered. They took her to church, introduced her to their friends, and showed her off as their new daughter. But after a few days, everything changed. The warmth in their eyes faded. The sweet words disappeared. And soon, Zahara realized that she wasn't a daughter to them, she was a servant. "Zahara, go and clean the living room," Mrs. Adeyemi ordered one morning, her voice cold and sharp. Zahara blinked. "Oh, okay." She thought it was just a small task. After all, she wanted to be helpful. But then came another order. "Zahara, wash the dishes." Then another. "Zahara, iron my dress." And another. "Zahara, polish my shoes." At first, she obeyed without question. She didn't want to seem ungrateful. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear, this wasn't temporary. This was her life now. A servant, not a daughter. The chores piled up. From morning till night, Zahara scrubbed floors, cooked meals, and washed clothes. If she ever hesitated or tried to rest, Mrs. Adeyemi's sharp voice would slice through the air. "You think this is a vacation? Get back to work." Mr. Adeyemi was no better. He didn't speak much to her, but when he did, it was always with a cold, dismissive tone. "Move faster. We don't have all day." One evening, as she served them dinner, she reached for a spoon but accidentally knocked over a glass of water. It shattered against the marble floor. Zahara's heart stopped. She immediately bent down to clean it, her hands trembling. "I'm sorry, Before she could finish, a sharp slap landed across her face. The force of it sent her reeling. Mrs. Adeyemi stood over her, eyes blazing with fury. "You clumsy, useless girl. Do you know how much that glass cost?" Zahara pressed a hand to her stinging cheek, tears pooling in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Mrs. Adeyemi glared at her for a long moment before scoffing. "Clean this up and get out of my sight." Zahara's hands shook as she picked up the broken pieces, swallowing back her sobs. That night, as she lay in bed, she realized something terrible. This house wasn't her home. It was her prison. The cruel punishments. The verbal abuse soon escalated to physical punishment. If Zahara didn't finish her tasks quickly enough, she would be slapped, shoved, or yanked by her arm. If she spoke back, even slightly, Mrs. Adeyemi would yank her hair and hiss, "You are nothing. You hear me? Nothing." Mr. Adeyemi mostly ignored her, unless he was angry. Then, he would grab her roughly by the arm and shake her. Worst of all was the starvation. Some nights, if Mrs. Adeyemi was in a bad mood, Zahara wasn't allowed to eat. "You want food? Work harder." She would lie in bed, her stomach aching, listening to the sounds of their laughter as they enjoyed the meals she had cooked. How could people be so cruel? How could they adopt her just to treat her like this? The terrifying secret. One night, as Zahara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she heard voices outside her door. Curious, she sat up and pressed her ear against the wood. It was Mr. and Mrs. Adeyemi. "She's getting too comfortable," Mr. Adeyemi muttered. "We need to make sure she stays in line." Mrs. Adeyemi sighed. "I know. But we must be careful. We don't want another situation like before." Zahara frowned. "Another situation?" Mr. Adeyemi's voice dropped lower. "The last girl started asking too many questions. We had no choice but to get rid of her." Zahara's breath hitched. The last girl. Her blood turned ice cold. She clamped a hand over her mouth, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. What had happened to the girl before her? Had they hurt her? Had they killed her? Terror gripped her. She needed to get out. She needed to run. But how? They watched her like a hawk. The gates were always locked. She had nowhere to go. As she lay back down, shaking, one thought filled her mind. If I don't escape soon, I might not make it out alive. The plan to escape. Zahara knew she didn't have much time. After overhearing Mr. and Mrs. Adeyemi's conversation about getting rid of the last girl, fear had settled deep in her bones. She had to get out. But how? The house was locked at night. The gates were always shut. She had no money, no phone, and nowhere to go. Still, she refused to let despair paralyze her. She had to escape. She couldn't end up like the last girl. A life of suffering. Days passed, and Zahara's situation only grew worse. Mrs. Adeyemi's cruelty increased. Every little mistake led to a slap, a yank of her hair, or worse. One morning, as Zahara scrubbed the kitchen floor, Mrs. Adeyemi deliberately knocked over a glass of water. "Clean it again," she said coldly. Zahara bit her tongue and wiped up the water, but as soon as she finished, Mrs. Adeyemi spilled another glass. "I said clean it again." Her hands trembled with suppressed anger, but she obeyed. That evening, they denied her dinner again. "Servants eat after their masters," Mr. Adeyemi sneered. Zahara went to bed hungry, her stomach aching. But that night, she made a decision. She was going to escape. No matter what it took. The pharmacy errand. The next morning, Zahara saw her chance. Mrs. Adeyemi lay on the couch, groaning in discomfort. "Ugh, I have a terrible headache," she complained. "Zahara, go to the pharmacy and get my medicine." She handed Zahara a few bills. Zahara's heart pounded. This was it, her opportunity. "Yes, ma'am," she said quietly, forcing herself to appear obedient. Stepping outside was like breathing for the first time in months. The sun touched her skin, and the wind whispered against her face. But she couldn't enjoy it. She had a mission. At the pharmacy, she handed the prescription note to the pharmacist. As he prepared the medicine, she hesitated, then whispered, "Do you have sleeping tablets?" The pharmacist raised an eyebrow. "For who?" "For my guardian," Zahara lied. "She has trouble sleeping." The man shrugged and handed her a small packet. Be careful with this. Only take one at a time. Zahara nodded, hiding the tablets in her pocket. When she left the pharmacy, she didn't go straight home. She slipped into a small alley, heart racing, and hid some bread and a bottle of water in her dress. She had stolen it from the money Mrs. Adeyemi had given her. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to keep her alive. The trap is set. That night, Zahara moved carefully. As she prepared dinner, her hands trembled, but she forced herself to stay calm. This had to work. She crushed the sleeping tablets into a fine powder and sprinkled it into the Adeyemi's food. Then she served them. She watched as Mr. and Mrs. Adeyemi ate, chewing slowly, drinking their wine, completely unaware. Minutes passed. Then, Mr. Adeyemi yawned. "I feel so tired," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "MRS." Adeyemi blinked heavily. "Me too." "What's happening?" Their heads drooped. Seconds later, their bodies slumped against the dining chairs, unconscious. Zahara didn't wait. She ran. The escape. She grabbed her small bag, containing a thin blanket, the stolen food, and a bottle of water, then bolted through the front door. The cold night air hit her like a wave, but she didn't stop. She ran. Through the gates. Down the dark streets. Her heart pounded in her chest as fear clawed at her. What if they wake up? What if they catch me? She ran faster. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. All she knew was one thing. She was finally free, struggles on the streets and a fateful reunion. Zahara had never felt more alone. She had escaped the Adeyemis, but freedom came with its own horrors. She had no home, no money, and no idea where to go. For the first few nights, she slept under a bridge, shivering in the cold, clutching her thin blanket tightly around her shoulders. The hunger was unbearable. The first day, she tried to survive on the bread she had stolen, but it was gone too quickly. By the third day, her stomach ached so badly that she could barely stand. She needed food. She needed a way to survive. Life on the streets. During the day, Zahara wandered through the city, searching for anything that could help her. She soon realized that the only way to make money was to sell something. She watched as other street kids sold small items, water, snacks, phone chargers, to passing cars in traffic. Maybe she could do the same. She used the last of her stolen money to buy a few bags of water from a street vendor. Then, she stood in the scorching sun, waving the water at passing cars. "Cold water for sale." "Fresh water," she called, her voice hoarse from thirst. At first, people ignored her. Some drivers rolled up their windows. Others waved her away as if she were nothing. But she refused to give up. Eventually, a kind woman stopped and handed her a few coins in exchange for a bag of water. "Thank you, ma'am," Zahara whispered, her hands shaking. That night, she used the little money she had earned to buy more water to sell the next day. It became her routine. Every morning, she stood in traffic, enduring the heat, the dust, the rejection. Sometimes, she didn't sell enough to buy food, and she went to bed hungry. Sometimes, the other street kids bullied her, stealing her money or pushing her out of their selling spot. But she kept going. She had no other choice. A familiar face in the crowd. One hot afternoon, as Zahara wiped sweat from her forehead, a sleek black car stopped near her. It was the kind of expensive car that only the rich could afford. Her heart leapt. Rich people always had money to spare. She hurried to the driver's side window, clutching her last bag of water. "Fresh water, sir," she said, forcing a hopeful smile. The window rolled down slowly. Zahara froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The driver was stunned. Her childhood friend. The boy who had made the orphanage bearable. The boy who had promised to always be there for her. And now, here he was, sitting in a car that looked like it cost more than everything she had ever owned. Ton stared at her, his eyes widening in shock. "Zahara," he whispered, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Her hands trembled. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. "Ton," she finally choked out. He looked her up and down, her dirty, oversized clothes, her sunburned skin, the exhaustion in her eyes. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice full of pain. Tears welled up in Zahara's eyes. "It's a long story," she whispered. Ton didn't hesitate. "Get in the car," he said firmly. "A safe place at last." Zahara hesitated for only a moment before climbing into the cool, air-conditioned car. For the first time in months, she felt safe. Ton drove in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Every few minutes, he glanced at her as if making sure she was still there. Finally, he pulled up to a beautiful house, large, but not as cold or intimidating as the Adeyemi's mansion. Ton turned to her. "Come inside. You'll be safe here." Zahara followed him inside, her legs shaking. The moment they stepped through the door, a warm, motherly voice filled the air. "Ton, you're back. Who's that with you?" Zahara turned to see a plump woman in a colorful wrapper and headscarf standing in the doorway. Her eyes were kind. "This is Zahara," Ton said. His voice was gentle now. "She's an old friend, and she needs help." The woman, Mama Bimp, walked up to Zahara and cupped her face in her hands. "Oh, my child," she murmured, looking at her with deep concern. "What have you been through?" Zahara burst into tears. She hadn't cried in so long. She had forced herself to be strong for so many months. But here, in this stranger's home, she finally let herself break. Mama Bimp pulled her into a tight hug, rubbing her back soothingly. "SHHH, my dear. You're safe now. No one will hurt you here." And for the first time since her parents died, Zahara believed it, justice and a new beginning. Zahara sat on the plush couch in Mama Bimp's living room, sipping a warm cup of tea. The past few days had been surreal, sleeping in a soft bed, eating full meals, and not having to flinch at every sound. She still had nightmares. She still woke up expecting to hear Mrs. Adeyemi's cold voice calling her to do chores or Mr. Adeyemi's impatient footsteps echoing down the hallway. But each morning, she woke up safe. And each morning, she reminded herself it's over. Or at least, it would be soon. Telling the truth. On the third day, Ton sat beside her on the couch, his expression serious. "Zahara," he said softly. "I need to know everything. What really happened to you?" Zahara looked down at her trembling hands. She didn't want to relieve it. But she knew she had to. She took a deep breath and told him everything. About the Adeyemis. About how they had beaten her, starved her, and treated her like a slave. About how she had overheard them talking about getting rid of the last girl they adopted. About how she had drugged their food and run for her life. By the time she finished, Mama Bimp was crying. "My poor child," she whispered, pulling Zahara into a warm embrace. Ton's hands had curled into fists. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark with anger. "They have to pay for this," he said firmly. "They can't keep doing this to children." Zahara hesitated. What if they come after me?" Ton's expression softened. He took her hands in his. "They won't," he promised. "I won't let them." Seeking justice. The next morning, Ton and Mama Bimp took Zahara to the police station. A serious-looking officer listened as Zahara told her story again, her voice trembling. When she finished, he exchanged a look with his colleagues. This isn't the first complaint we've had about the Adiyemis, he said grimly. But we've never had enough evidence to act. Ton leaned forward. Well, now you do. The officer nodded. We will investigate immediately. Zahara wasn't sure if anything would happen. But 3 days later, the news broke: Mr. and Mrs. Adeyemi had been arrested. Justice is served. Zahara sat in Mama Bim's home, watching the evening news. Prominent business couple, Mr. and Mrs. Adeyemi, have been arrested for child abuse and human trafficking. Reports confirm that multiple children have suffered in their care, and further investigations are ongoing. Zahara's heart pounded as she saw footage of the Adeyemis being led out of their mansion in handcuffs. Mrs. Adeyemi's perfect composure was gone, her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. Mr. Adeyemi struggled against the officers, shouting about how it was all a misunderstanding. But no one was listening. No one believed them. For the first time in years, Zahara felt free. A future full of hope. Months passed. Then years. Zahara healed. Slowly, but surely. Ton and Mama Bimp became her family. The family she had lost. She went back to school. She started helping at orphanages, comforting children who had suffered like she had. And through it all, Ton was by her side. Their friendship deepened, their bond growing stronger with each passing year. Until, one day, it became something more. A love that lasts. One evening, under the soft glow of the city lights, Ton took Zahara's hands. Zahara, he said gently, you are the strongest person I have ever known. I never want to live a day without you. He got down on one knee, pulling out a small velvet box. Will you marry me? Tears welled in Zahara's eyes. She had once thought she would never feel love again. That she would never be safe enough to love. But here, with Ton, she wasn't afraid anymore. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times, yes. A legacy of love. Years later, Zahara and Ton built a home filled with love. Not just for themselves, but for the children who had no one. They started an orphanage, taking in children who had been abandoned or mistreated. They became the parents that Zahara had once lost. They created a place where no child would ever feel unwanted. Where no child would ever suffer like she had. One evening, Zahara sat in the garden, watching the children play. Ton sat beside her, placing a hand on her belly, where their first child grew. You've come so far, he said softly. Zahara smiled, her heart full. She had survived. She had healed. And now, she was home. The end.